but I will get us started by saying welcome to Word on the Street Live to Ambassador Dan Shapiro, who is joining us from Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. And it is really great to see you. And I know you're in the midst of a long journey around the Middle East, and we'll want to hear, I know folks are going to want to hear a lot about what you're hearing on the ground, but we'll give it a couple of minutes for folks to stream in. And Dan, you'll get to hear some of the rap that Elon and I go through. Sometimes it's about the color of our shirts. Sometimes it's about where we are.
Today.
Yeah, for once, we're not like matching twins here. And you've got the black T-shirt thing going. So
that's a very podcast, bro.
Yeah.
So like, Dan, you're adapting well to like post-government life.
Podcast, bro, plus it's midnight here. So, I'm not dressing up for anybody.
Right, exactly. We don't take it personally, but well, we were just chatting as we were getting on about the fact that I'm just caught here right from Capitol Hill, and it was touch and go whether or not I was going to make it onto the podcast in time. And today there's something called the National Defense Authorization Act that they are trying to pass through Congress. This is one of the rare things that they actually have to legislate. Dan, you probably remember this as a must-pass piece of legislation, right? This is sort of like basic to the function of government. And yet again, another piece of legislation just simply stalled because 5 Republicans were holding back. And so I was watching this in real time and wondering what the payoff was going to be to get these folks to sign up.
Yeah, I mean, I was watching something else at the time, Jeremy,
Yes?
which was the fact that like Pete Alonso and Edwin Diaz are no longer in the New York
baseball
Mets.
references.
So,
Yes.
like for some of our audience, maybe for those of you who are into deep machinations on Capitol Hill, like you can listen to Jeremy
about the NDAA. That's why they come on to Word on the Street, is to hear about what's happening in Washington, D.C., not what's happening on the Mets.
I don't know. We can give them a little bit of a baseball podcast.
Yeah.
Dan's a Cubs fan, I know. So, but
I'm a Cubs fan, but I'm much more into the Bears at the moment, who are storming into the playoffs, and looks like Caleb Williams is a year ahead of schedule. So I'm very excited.
Well, it's good to have some good news in the sports realm for Chicago. I can relate to this from a Washington, D.C. sports fan, that there's not a whole lot of good news going on here, although the Caps are in first place right now. So we'll keep our fingers crossed on that. So I think we are ready to go. It's Word on the Street Live. It's Wednesday, 4 p.m. Eastern, but in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, it is midnight. And I want to say a warm thank you to Ambassador Dan Shapiro, who was America's ambassador to Israel were you the longest serving ambassador in that position? I can't remember now if you set the record.
Longest in many years. There were actually 2. One guy named Walworth Barber, who served almost 11 years. President Kennedy appointed him. And then the great Sam Lewis served for about 8 years. But Sam left in 1985, I think. And so since then, I'm definitely the longest. I served 5.5 years in the job.
So there definitely should be some like medal, that you get for representing the United States in Israel for that length of time. It is a yeoman's service. And so we thank you as American citizens for the service. And Elon, you're also just back from Doha. And I thought we'd start really by getting both of your perspectives on what you were hearing on the ground. The ceasefire is not much of a ceasefire, but it's an agreement that is holding to some extent in the breach, perhaps more than fully in effect. But the question is, are we going to get from phase 1 to phase 2? Can we get international forces into Gaza? Can we get disarmament? And you were sitting there in Doha, and you've been traveling the region, Dan, and really anxious to hear what you guys were hearing.
Well, Dan, why don't we go to you first on what you've taken away so far, and then I'll chime in.
Sure, thanks. So Doha Forum is a massive conference, something like 5,000 people from all over the region, all over the world, really, and a huge delegation from Washington. Lots of people that Elon and I both know, you both know as well, Jeremy, were there. And obviously on these issues, there's a relief, of course, that the ceasefire did occur, even though it's not fully in place, or it's not always preventing some kinds of clashes. But the main discussion that I was attentive to was the question of what next. Can phase 2 of President President Trump's 20-point plan really get underway. And the main reason actually I wanted to go was to have a chance to talk to Qatari officials, because I think they hold a significant key to the answer to that question. Of course, you all and your listeners mostly know phase two, includes many elements: disarmament of Hamas, bringing an international stabilization force, reconstruction funds, Palestinian Technocratic Committee under this Board of Peace, and a credible pathway to Palestinian statehood. But to me, the key that unlocks the rest of it is disarmament. That I've always feared, really from the beginning of the war, that unless Hamas really was removed from power, really disarmed, there really isn't going to be a day after. The reason I think that's important to bring to the Qataris is because they have, for obvious reasons, since they've hosted Hamas, since they've been a supporter of Hamas in certain ways, they and Turkey, also a very important ideological supporter of Hamas, proved their leverage with Hamas after Israel's attempted strike on Hamas leaders in Doha in September. That's when President Trump saw the inflection point to bring pressure to bear on Netanyahu to agree to terms that he hadn't agreed to, which was an end of the war without Hamas's destruction. And Qatar and Turkey did the same to Hamas, to agree to release all the hostages without a full Israeli withdrawal. And that demonstrates to me that they have leverage when they choose to use it. And I think they need to use it to get Hamas to take those next steps of disarmament, handing over weapons, actually significant Hamas leaders and fighters leaving Gaza for other locations. Otherwise, I don't think all the rest of those elements, the reconstruction, the International Stabilization Force, the Palestinian Technocratic Committee, I don't think they get a foothold, because nobody wants to go in and have that fight with Hamas. President Trump, and I think most of us, don't want to see Israel have to go back in and do it militarily. So this was, I think, the really important question. It still hangs over it, whether or not disarmament will occur. I believe the Qataris hold a really important piece of that, and made that case to the Prime Minister of Qatar and some other Qatari officials. But that really, I think, dominated the conversation. Can we get off of the end of phase one, which everyone's more or less happy occurred, and can we get into phase two, and what are the hurdles to clear to make that possible?
Yeah, and Dan, no, I agree. That was definitely what the focus was. Are we going to actually get to phase two? I do think we need to think about the sequencing with disarmament a little bit differently, because I have a hard time seeing a world where Hamas gives up all of its weapons up front. That's just ahistorical. It's not how these deals happen. So the way I think you get there, and this is a lot of, we were working on a lot of this in the Biden administration, a lot of similar ideas. The way I think you get there is you get an agreement on this international force going in. That's going to require, Qatari pressure. It might even require Turkish troops. The Turks were actually the ones who were most willing, at least publicly in this setting, to talk about sending in troops. I think that the Israelis would have major issues with that. And so that's a real open question. The Egyptian troops, also essential, and others. But you start to bring in these forces, and you have them not fighting Hamas, but training an alternative, training Palestinian security forces. And frankly, you're probably going to need a deal between Hamas and Egypt, between Hamas and Turkey, where they agree not to shoot at each other. And so why does Hamas accept this? It accepts it because it's under so much pressure, and you start to build this alternative. And if you start to slowly weaken Hamas and replace it with an alternative, you only create more leverage to, over time, disarm them further. But I think we need to be realistic that, in my mind, is a better sequencing that might work, and how I always thought about it. In Hamas's mind, they think, hey, we can be Hezbollah. We can just sort of hang out here and let this alternative build. But we have to demonstrate to them that they can't be Hezbollah, because Hezbollah had freedom of rearmament coming from all this stuff that was going into, Syria from Iran and then being pushed into the Bekaa Valley. Here you have much more control of the borders, and you're going to have to, over time, weaken them, replace them with some kind of Palestinian security force, and essentially get them to surrender that way over time. But if you start with, you must disarm tomorrow, I have a hard time seeing them do that. So maybe that's a bit of a difference between how you and I think about it. I think we're going to have to see over the next few weeks. Bibi is now coming to Miami near the end of the year. That's going to be a pretty decisive moment. We keep hearing that there's something potentially coming. we've also heard people say, well, the Trump administration is too distracted. Witkoff and Kushner are also doing all this stuff on Russia, Ukraine, and and how much can you essentially have just two or three people doing everything. You need depth.
Teams.
You need teams, things that you and I worked on, and it's unclear if these guys have it. I'm gonna continue to support what the Trump administration is trying to do here, even while I disagree with them on so many other things. I mean, maybe the one thing I will fundamentally disagree with them on, maybe I'm most worried about, is they're also refusing to allow any kind of role for the Palestinian Authority. And Palestinian Authority has many challenges, but there is no alternative to the Palestinian Authority that could function in this space. And so I think it's time for them to really get over that, and also tell the Israelis it's time to get over that, because I think, again, that's an ideological position for the Israelis that's tied to Ben Gvir and Smotrich and Netanyahu's coalition. In the end, you and I struggled with this in government. You don't have to lead with the Israelis and tell them, you must have the Palestinian Authority and just throw it in their face for their politics, but you need to get them to agree to let the PA play a role here.
Dan, we have a bit of a time delay.
There's a lot of extra.
There's a bit of a lag from when we stop speaking and when you start. So I apologize for that, but do answer the question, respond to Ilan. But I also wanted to ask you to share anything you can about any perspective you're gaining from the Saudi point of view too. I'm really interested to hear what their take is on the broader contours of their regional engagement that they have been at the forefront of. So if you could both, respond to Elon's point, but maybe also throw in a little bit about the Saudis.
Yeah, thanks, and sorry for the delay on this end. So I think the exact sequencing of disarmament, there probably is some bridge between your version of mine, Elon's. I think the Qataris and the Turks are still the essential player to get Hamas to do that, whether they agree to do it instantaneously or whether they agree to do it in some moderately phased period. I don't think it can linger, because the danger is that they sort of settle in and they hold on and they dig in into tunnels, and at the end they're still there in a maybe weaker than the Hezbollah model, but still playing a role. But they've really got to be removed from power and got to be removed from their weapons, removed from them, and them removed from the tunnels, and ultimately the tunnels have to be decommissioned as well. But those are the key actors to make that happen. And then I'm in agreement on the need to make sure the Palestinian Authority is part of this. Now, Palestinian Authority, of course, has a lot of work to do to reform itself and to demonstrate its capability to deliver as a governance body, and to really be able to triumph over extremists, both those in the West Bank and those that they might confront in Gaza. So there's work to do, but there isn't an alternative to the Palestinian Authority, even if the Technocratic Committee is sort of a bridge to get there. Saudi Arabia, right. So really important time to come here and have these conversations with the Saudis a couple of weeks, I guess 3 weeks, 4 weeks now after the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's visit to Washington. And major the main item on my agenda in discussions here is to understand their thinking on normalization with Israel, and what role they intend to try to play here. And I'd summarize it this way. I think the Saudis remain open to ultimately taking that step, but not now, not immediately. And I think it's unlikely that it's going to take place in 2026. I think they don't have a big incentive to help Netanyahu, at least at this point in time, and going into an election. And they have said very clearly, and I know Lindsey Graham is quoted today, and he's a close confidant of MBS, that they need clarity on the direction toward a Palestinian state. The exact formula that's required, only MBS will decide, and no one really knows exactly what he'll need. But he needs something serious, and he's not going to get that during an Israeli election. I don't think there's any chance of that. We know Netanyahu will run in part on his longstanding opposition to that, which is, will have some currency with Israelis. They're also going to need to see serious progress on getting Gaza into the phase 2 and a better, a more stable situation, and improving conditions for Palestinians. How active they'll be, how much they'll be sort of passive and let others take the lead, or whether they'll try to lean into that or just send money into that, that's still not entirely clear. I think I would say this more generally. I think MBS does see value for the wider regional project that he's committed to, and for Saudi Arabia's leadership and some access to Israeli technology and things like that. And of course, the desire to help Trump, his friend, who's really leaned into this relationship and has made clear and did make clear during the visit that he wants Saudi Arabia in the Abraham Accords. So I think there's still a direction that he's inclined to go. But the caveats are, number one, public opinion in Saudi Arabia has turned in a harder direction, not surprisingly, given what's been on people's screens for the last 2 years from Gaza, and especially I think that's true from what we hear among younger Saudis. And it could change, and he can help direct that change, but that's a real issue for them to deal with. Second caveat is that Trump, gave away a lot of the leverage that we in the Biden administration had sort of associated with things that the Saudis would get at the time normalization occurs, not in advance. He made a security deal. Maybe it wasn't a treaty, but clearly some security commitments. The F-35 aircraft, at least a partial civil nuclear agreement, AI chips, very advanced AI chips. So that could reduce the Saudi initiative in the moment of truth, when maybe packaging those together would have been a little bit more persuasive. And the last thing I'll just comment on, if you spend any time here, it's just incredibly dynamic and energetic, and there's building everywhere. They are busy. They are busy building and developing and expanding, and this kind of relentless pursuit of the Crown Prince's Vision 2030 plan, which is a massive economic and social reimagining of the country. And Israel normalization is may in that context be seen sort of as a nice to have, and maybe something that does contribute to stability in the region, which is helpful to his vision of 2030 and Saudi Arabia as a tourism destination and the like. But on the other hand, they might be a little too busy with other priorities to chase it and to really prioritize it in the way that we might, or Israel might. So I'm cautiously hopeful that it's still in the mix. I don't think it's a 2026 prospect. I think there's a lot of work that can be done to prepare it for 2027, and of course, the outcome of the Israeli election may have something to do with that. But those are my takeaways from a couple days on the ground here.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely always been my take on it in terms of the timing, that this just had to come after the Israeli election, because with Netanyahu in charge and or on the way to elections, that this just was not going to be on the agenda. But there is this 2-year period after the elections where Trump is still, in search of his Nobel Prize. He has this special relations with the Gulf, and there could be a new Israeli government, and there is that brief window there where I think there's an opportunity. I worry that if that opportunity isn't seized, I'm not quite sure what the pathways are in a positive direction if we don't see movement in 27, 28. But I think that's the right time frame for people to have.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think so much will depend on the election in Israel, because you're going to need to see some steps from the Israelis, as
Right.
Dan said, on the Palestinian issue.
Yeah.
I mean, the only other thing, maybe I'll just throw in one other thing, and we should probably move on.
Yeah.
But the only other, just a couple of other random observations from Doha that I thought were kind of interesting. One was the role of Tucker Carlson in interviewing Embar and really going after.
Embar is, for those who don't know.
Embar is the, I always forget the full name, but Embar is the Qatari prime minister / foreign minister / really chief point man and negotiator on their key deals, such as the hostage deal and the ceasefire. And Tucker interviewing him and just being very brutal about the Israelis. I do think the Qataris sometimes get a raw deal. They get unfair targeting here for doing things that sometimes they were asked to do. I also think they're not exactly innocent, and the way it was framed in that conversation was very much just put all the blame on Israel, which was very interesting to see. The other just kind of meta observation I took away was, it's my first time, at least, in the room with the new Syrian president who came to power just exactly a year ago, while everybody was at the Doha Forum, Ahmed Ashara. And I got to say, he had the room in a very impressive, very political superstar kind of way. Super impressive in how he answered questions. Had kind of that, that we have some of, key American politicians have have had not just kind of a boring, dull speaker, somebody who had people parrying back and forth with Christian Amanpour, who was not giving him an easy time. And so, I mean, a lot remains to be seen in that situation. And I'm not, I think we're going to have to wait and see with Syria. But it was impressive and it was interesting to watch the way the room reacted.
All right, but you are going to shift us to a
Yes.
different topic.
Yeah. So the reason we brought you on here, and what we wanted to talk about, is, last week we had Ben Rhodes on, after he wrote an article about, what he called the hug BB strategy and his concerns with it over the last 15 years and how it doesn't work. You and I have talked about it. You had a different reaction. I think there were things you agreed with in Ben's article. I think there were things you really disagreed with in Ben's article. And, as somebody who was our ambassador for 5.5 years, and also, I mean, really, I don't know anybody who has spent more time with Israeli officials since Bibi Netanyahu was elected in 2009 than you. So very interested to get your take in response to what Ben wrote, and like where you see the U.S.-Israel relationship going.
Yeah, so thanks, guys. Thanks for the opportunity to have this discussion, and appreciate it, Elon, your and my kind of back and forth on it. So let me lay out a few thoughts, but I'll probably need to do this in a couple of chunks. So I'll talk for a few minutes and then I'll obviously stop, but I want to pick it up again because I think there are different elements to it. I do agree with Ben's framing. Ben and I were good colleagues for 8 years of the Obama administration. I consider ourselves friends, although we're not in close touch, but I really did disagree with his framing, and I think he made his case for essentially for cutting off all military assistance to Israel. I think that is the recommendation on both moral and political grounds, and I think I really think it fails on both those tests. But I think there's also a strategic dimension, which I don't think was even addressed, which I think is really important and very dangerous. Let me just say a couple of things. I agree with some of the things he said, as you said, Elon. Look, obviously, there's been terrible Palestinian suffering in Gaza, and that has to be acknowledged. Hunger, civilian deaths, and injured people displaced multiple times. It's terrible, and any person with any humanity has to acknowledge that. The exact number of civilian deaths is, of course, disputed, but it's too many, right? Like it's obviously too many. And each one is an entire world and a tragedy, and that we just have to say. And the second thing is that aspects of Israel's conduct of the war contributed to too many civilian deaths and deserve criticism. And as I was at the Pentagon for all of 2024, and in regular discussions with Israeli counterparts, and their descriptions of their targeting protocols are very similar to those of many Western militaries, including our own. Of course, they pointed out correctly that Hamas was deeply embedded within and underneath civilian populations and in schools and hospitals, and they steal and hijack aid, and of course that they welcome casualties that they use as propaganda. But none of that alleviates, and this was our case to them. None of that alleviates Israel's responsibility to do everything possible, and then redouble that effort to minimize civilian casualties. And I do think their tolerance of civilian casualties in pursuit of what were actually very legitimate military targets was higher than ours and higher than it should be. And the third thing I really agree with is that I'm as you said, Elon, very familiar with Benjamin Netanyahu's leadership, and this particular government that he leads is terrible. And of course, he's been focused on his own self-interest with his trial. That's led him to bring extremists and racists like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich into the government, and be dependent on them, and that produced delays in aid getting into Gaza, some outrageous statements that advocated ethnic cleansing and annexation, even if that wasn't the actual policy, delays in hostage negotiations at key points, and unchecked extremist violence by certain Israelis in West Bank. So those are all true, and I'll say that up front. But I'll also say this: I think Ben's argument misses what I think is the broader frame here. At least it dismisses that there were multiple things happening at the same time. I mean, the article doesn't address what needs to be addressed up front. October 7th, the worst attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. the terrible violence and brutality, and of course the hostages being taken, which obviously needed a response, needed to be defended against, needed to be ensured it couldn't be repeated. And then, of course, other things, attacks immediately that started on two other fronts, from Hezbollah in Lebanon, from the Houthis in Yemen, and then ultimately Iran, the sponsor of all these organizations, attacking Israel directly with massive barrages of missiles and drones in April and October. Um, so those are all happening at the same time, and when we're talking about a question of whether the United States should have been supporting Israel through this, that has to be taken into account as well. And I think the way I think about Israel during this period is not that it's this, what I took from his description, a rogue actor kind of intent on doing the worst things in humanity, but an imperfect democratic partner. And we're an imperfect democratic partner ourselves in other ways, but they are a democratic partner that's imperfect. They are also a partner that's beset by enemies and terrorists that are sworn to their destruction. And both pieces of that really matter and have to be taken into account. I mean, the second part, enemies sworn to their destruction. I mean, we see that even today. The absolute commitment, the ideological, absolute commitment by Iran and this whole network to try to destroy Israel, even after they've suffered very severe blows by Israeli and U.S. military power over the last 2 years. They're still trying. They're still trying to rebuild and still trying to prepare for another maybe decisive round. And there's an important need to deter that. I mean, Iran will spend its last rial to rebuild its ballistic missiles to attack Israel, to arm Hezbollah, even when people in Tehran cannot even turn on the water. It's remarkable, and we have to remember that. As for the kind of imperfect democratic partner part of that, look, I mean, I think it was suggested that there was a mistake even for Biden to go to Israel in the first week of the war to express solidarity, and when he went, he warned about the mistakes that the United States made after 9/11, and talking about how justified grief and outrage shouldn't consume reason. Um, so what followed meet that test, but this proposal, which I took from the conversation and the article, was just to kind of wash our hands of this relationship, I think is kind of upside down. We've argued that after 9/11, the mistakes we made shouldn't define us, and that the world should, work with us as we've tried unevenly, but have tried to find a better path. And we Democrats are disgusted by, Trump's, immoral and outrageous activity and lawless activity. But we want our partners not to write us off as if that defines the United States as well. So I think that's really important. Last thing I'll say on this before we stop, and I want to get back to the politics and the strategic aspects of this, is that I do disagree with the description of the hug BB strategy. I disagree with that critique. I think it's kind of a lazy formula, and I don't think it really grapples with reality. Look, first of all, for 16 of the last 17 years, he's the prime minister, or 15 of the last 16 years. He's the prime minister that the Israeli people elected, like it or not. We do have to deal with him. He exists. The country exists. So they are a partner. And we'll have our disagreements, very severe ones sometimes. But he does not equal Israel, as we've all seen by the hundreds of thousands of Israelis that have been in the streets protesting him almost the entire time that he's been prime minister since the last election. Now, maybe somebody over time, even during the Obama year, made the argument that we should hug Bibi as a way of, getting him to do, things we wanted him to do. That was not, though, my experience that was what our policy was in the Obama administration, or that's what Biden was doing after October 7th. What I thought he was doing was supporting Israel under attack. And like you said, I've spent more hours with Bibi Netanyahu than probably any Democratic official, with the possible exception of John Kerry, between the end of the Clinton administration and October 7th. I'll just, mark it that way. But, what I took from, President Obama, for example, and Ben raised, after the the fight over the Iran nuclear deal, and speech in Congress, which is a terrible decision, and we were very angry about it. But Obama actually made the decision at that point to proceed with the MOU, the memorandum of understanding on 10 years of military assistance. Now, why did he do that? Not to reward Bibi. He did that because he calculated, and I agreed with him, of course, that it served our interests, that we'd enable this democratic ally to defend themselves against these deadly enemies who are also our enemies. And the things that have happened over the last 2 years that are much less controversial than what happened in Gaza, which were the defeat of Hezbollah, strikes on the Houthis, the strikes against Iran, obviously the success of missile defense. Those all derive from that MOU. And I don't know how you would argue that we'd be better off if in response to our upset by the speech in Congress in 2015, which, by the way, helped Obama get that deal passed in Congress. It didn't hurt it, so we won that battle. That we'd be better off without Israel having those capabilities. Now, last word on this is just I do think it's absolutely true that in the conduct of this relationship, one second, that that the United States should use leverage to get better results. And I don't argue that Biden administration did everything right during the war. But two examples that are discussed and criticized from all directions, but I think are worth taking a look at, are the Rafah campaign and the pause of the shipment of 2,000-pound bombs. In the one case, when Israel said they were going to go do this Rafah campaign to get to 4 Hamas battalions, Biden said, no, stop. There's 1.8 million Palestinian civilians taking shelter there. It can't be done the same way Gaza City and Khan Yunis were done. It has to be done differently. So let's have a conversation about it. And over several weeks, there was a very serious, mostly military to military conversation about what that plan could look like and how it could be done, first by giving time for people to evacuate, and then much more deliberately and much more precisely to get at the legitimate military targets, but with far, far fewer civilian casualties. And that's actually what happened. The second, in that 2,000-pound bomb shipment case, and criticized by everybody, after a few weeks, Gallant, the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, was prepared to sign an agreement that would say they can have the 2,000-pound bombs, they just can't use them in Gaza, which is where the concern was because of the congested civilian population. And so it didn't get signed for all kinds of various reasons. I don't go into it, but it's an example of the kind of dialogue between the militaries and agreements that can be reached at the political level that I think are the proper use of U.S. leverage in this relationship. And maybe there's even more of that. But for an ally who's under fire and defending itself, that we also need to uphold, and we want them to be able to, but we also need them to uphold U.S. standards and values. That, to me, is the right approach. So I'll stop there.
So,
I've got more to say, but let me.
So I will say, last week we had Ben on, and we definitely gave him the hour, to make his case, and we definitely want to hear the alternative. I certainly have some points. I know Elon has some points. We'd like to just take a couple of minutes and point out some of the counter arguments, perhaps.
Sure. And Dan, to start with the fact that, first of all, J Street's not exactly where Ben is either. We're very much supportive of Israel having the weapons it needs to defend itself. We're very much supportive of things like Iron Dome and, having the things it needs to defend itself from strikes against Iran and Hezbollah and otherwise. We were not out there calling for a ceasefire at the beginning because J Street believed I was in the administration. But at least my personal belief is absolutely Israel had a need, a requirement, and a responsibility to respond to October 7th. I think where I disagree with you and where it breaks down a little bit for me is, treating Israel like a normal country. It's one thing to support an ally in need. It's another thing to give a blank check to a series of policies that we knew were wrong, that we didn't want to see the Israelis conduct, and never really truly using our leverage, right? So this is my big concern. We'll pull back. The United States is a global superpower. In the aftermath of the October 7th attack, we provided the Israelis with $14 billion in weapons, right? We were out there sending aircraft carriers, sending support, doing everything we needed to do to defend themselves. When we start asking them to end the war, when we start telling them we don't want you to do Rafah, did we use enough leverage to actually stop that? Did anybody think that Rafah was actually going to fundamentally change the outcome of this conflict? I didn't think it was strategically, because Israel refused, again, to do any kind of serious post-war planning discussions with us try to set up a Palestinian force that can take parts of Gaza, repeated all of the mistakes that happened after 9/11 that Joe Biden warned them against. They did it again. They did exactly what we did in Iraq. In fact, they did it worse because they were warned about it. We were sitting there telling them to do other things. And, I've even had Israeli officials, former military officers tell me we had planning assumptions that the war would end in January of 24 because you guys would make us end it. And you guys would stand up and just say enough is enough. And Joe Biden would come out very publicly and say, as Donald Trump ultimately did, and squeeze us and make us end it. And we never did. So Rafah is the perfect example. Yes, we nudged Israel on the margins and we got a better outcome in Rafah. I also worked on that policy. I supported the idea of engaging the Israelis on that. But why were we even in that position? Is the best we can do to kind of prevent the Israelis from doing a better job at a fight that we disagreed with using billions of dollars of American weapons? Or did we have more leverage? Could we treat Israel like a normal ally and partner? Which means when we agree, we work together. When we disagree, we don't just tell you we disagree, but you can't use our stuff for things we fundamentally disagree with. Like, you exercise leverage. You don't continue to protect Israel at the UN Security Council from every resolution, even if we disagree with them. You don't necessarily start threatening sanctions against, ICC. You just let that work continue. You don't have to protect every single piece of behavior. And I think Israel's conduct of the war in Gaza is fundamentally different than their conduct of what they did with regards to Lebanon, with regards to the Houthis, and with regards to Iran. And you have to separate the behavior of those two things. And I just think we could have done a lot more to stop that and use our very significant leverage. It might not have worked, but I don't think we ever really used it.
And I'll just chime in, and I apologize, it's a little 2-on-1. So, and it's past midnight, so I don't mean to be rude, but it is also, I think, important to step back that it's not just about the last 2 years. I would argue that the fundamental thesis of the U.S. effort to be a broker towards peace, to play the positive role over probably close to 30 years. I mean, this really dates back to when you and I first met and first engaged on all this back in the Clinton years. This is 30 years ago. The fundamental thesis has been that if we don't say yes to everything that Israel, and not just Bibi, but whoever the government was of Israel, if we don't embrace them and hug them tightly, then they will never make the concessions necessary for peace. And I come away from these last 30 years believing we actually got it completely backwards. That the hug and the giving of everything that could possibly be ever asked, it just simply was pocketed, all the way to the bank, and nothing was ever given. And in reality, perhaps saying no, might have created a different incentive structure. I think the theory of the game that the U.S. has played diplomatically for 20 to 30 years to try to move this conflict in the right direction has actually ended up being relatively counterproductive. So I'll stop there.
Actually, maybe can I make one last little point that I just thought about, because I think you did also make the comparison to there's a difference between a government and an ally. And again, just normal ways of treating. You can be friends with Israel and have real concerns about the government and react the same way. You look at a lot of our allies around the world, they are managing the relationship with Trump, but they're not treating Trump the way they treated Biden. And they are, especially the Europeans, for example, with what we saw in the national security strategy. So you really do have to, you can maintain the core of the relationship, but I think we've just gone way too far in deferring to Netanyahu now for a long time. Not as extremely as Ben presents it, but I think there's a lot more that we could have done there.
Yeah, well, so I'm partially, I came on especially to react to the discussion with Ben and to his piece, which does go quite a bit further than what you're describing. He is calling for a complete a cutoff of all assistance to Israel. Look, as I said, I'll just repeat. I don't think I don't make the case that the Biden administration did everything right, and so there's definitely room for that. discussion, and I have no hesitation and problem, and I said it about using leverage. That should be part of this relationship, and that's part of normal ties between countries. I do think there's some combination, right? And you referenced, I think one of you referenced, what sort of Trump did at the end. Well, Trump maybe have been even more an exaggerated form of both the hug and the leverage, right?
Mhm.
I mean, from the first day of the Trump administration, he said no to almost nothing Netanyahu wanted to do, and things that we all should have been very critical of. I was, but I didn't hear enough of that. Actually, I heard much more of like a democratic civil war about something that happened a year or two ago than criticizing the Gaza Riviera plan or uh, not objecting to the cutoff of aid, of humanitarian assistance going in, or not using the Iran strikes as the off ramp, or not objecting to the Gaza City operation. Like there were several things Trump did all through that year that were deserving of a lot of criticism and were much more accommodating of what Israel was doing than anything Biden was doing. And then at the moment of truth, when there was an inflection point, there was a strike. He heard from the Gulf. Maybe he saw the opportunity. Then he used the leverage. So maybe it's an exaggerated version of what we're talking about, which is that there's room for both of those in this relationship. I have no problem using the leverage to try to get outcomes we want. But again, I started by reacting to something that goes a lot farther than what either of you are describing, which is say, look, this is a partnership that no longer has the value that we've previously ascribed to it, and we should wash our hands of it. And that I certainly disagree with.
Yeah, and that's it's the luxury of J Street. We get to sit in the middle here, and but it's also kind of our position. I will say, Dan, let's like shift the conversation, because the other thing you and I pretty recently talked about is, okay, so how do Democrats actually talk about this going into 27 and 28? Because I get it, and I agree with you. We have this Democratic civil war. Somebody actually explained to me the other day there's a psychological phenomenon associated to what happens when somebody who you expect to do better disappoints you versus somebody who you have no expectations of disappoints you. And I think that's a lot of what's happening inside the Democratic base and the reaction to Biden. That's not necessarily coming to Trump. Nobody had any expectations that Trump would do better. And so you're right. Like, it's crazy that, for a year while Trump was doing all these things, there was no protesting outside Marco Rubio's house, whereas Tony Blinken was being, attacked every day. But we are where we are in terms of politics and in terms of the Democratic Party. So as we head into 27 and 28, and just 26, how do you see it? Like, how should Democrats be articulating their position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and on Israel?
Right. This is important, and I do think that the Civil War aspect of it is concerning, because it's hard to win elections when you're tearing apart your own team. And we're heading into two election cycles where we absolutely have to win, absolutely, to save our own country. And this isn't going to be the main issue that's going to define that, but that's a time to be focused on where we, as much as possible, where we agree, and have our tent be big enough, and certainly not be fighting about things that have already happened, rather than focus on what the current administration is doing now. Um, look, I mean, there is lots of polling, and I recognize it. It's obvious that shows there's decline in support for Israel, or for assistance to Israel, in many different aspects of the electorate, of the population. I do think it's a thin reed on which to build a political coalition. And again, stop reacting so much to what you're saying, Elon and Jeremy, but to what I heard Ben saying. Um, in part because it's a thin reed, because elections generally are not going to be decided primarily on foreign policy issues, and this issue, as passionate as people feel about it now, it's time's going to go on. Hopefully this war is behind us. New issues will change. Trump will have new outrages all the time. There will be other issues, but also, more fundamentally, I think setting up a litmus test for Democrats about what they should say or what they shouldn't say. It's really a means of subtraction, not addition. Now, so again, in the previous discussion, some references to, well, people just keep saying the same APAC talking points. Look, you know me, I've worked with APAC and I've disagreed with APAC. I've worked with J Street and I've disagreed with J Street. I don't recite anybody's talking points. I say what I think. Um, but I think we should be careful about trying to sort of, banish from democratic politics people who, share some views we might disagree with, or who might agree with an organization that we don't always agree with. It's a very strange way to try to build a majority when you have to win. So, the fundamentals of the conversation we were having in the previous section about Israel being an important partner, a democratic partner, a partner for whom we still have a strong moral and strategic interest to ensure it is safe and able to defend itself, and that we have expectations of, and that we are prepared to use the leverage that comes with that relationship. And the leverage comes from the support, right? Once you withdraw the support, then you also don't have the leverage. But we should be prepared to have those conversations with Israelis, which I think are, again, much more effectively implemented in dialogues between governments and militaries than resolutions passed by Congress, or those types of sort of more rhetorical efforts. That's fine, and it's fine to say that we need to ensure that if there are legitimate security operations need to be conducted, that they're conducted in a way that minimize civilian casualties. We need to be sure that all the elements of the 20-point plan that conclude progress toward a credible path of Palestinian statehood are implemented, and that should be part of the things we insist on. And we also have to be just cautious. And I'll stop with this. That while we're having this debate, and there's a lot of things we agree on here. There are some things we disagree on. Let's be honest about that. But there's some other voices in this debate, right? And making themselves heard. There's a much more extreme fringe that is talking not just about no aid to Israel, about no legitimacy for Israel to exist as a Jewish state. We hear that, and we hear that from prominent people. That is going to raise the question of will we as Democrats, will we as Americans take a position when there are efforts to support international pressure on Israel to kind of define its existence, or will we be indifferent to the campaign of Israel's enemies to destroy it? I don't think that passes a moral test, but I also don't think it passes a political test, because I think that's if we don't make sure those positions are kind of outside the mainstream. I don't want to talk about litmus tests, but I think we have to be able to speak clearly to those things. That will be a political loser with the voters who actually decide elections in the parts of the country where we actually have to win in order to win elections.
And Dan, I'm curious your take on this, but I also think that there's a very significant part of the electorate that won't be able to support a candidate that isn't willing to acknowledge the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. And I think that the balancing of being able to talk about both peoples having legitimate rights and both peoples having legitimate needs is going to be absolutely key to the Democratic Party holding some form of a coalition together. The pressures, as you well know, I mean, what's fun for me is we've got on this discussion right now two of the most recent Jewish liaisons for presidential campaigns, right? Dan played that role in 2008 for Barack Obama, and Elon played that role for Kamala Harris in 2024. But as you both know, the politics of this issue in the prior couple of decades have always led Democratic candidates to really worry more about the flank of their support and the flank of their talking points that would reinforce the legitimacy of Israel and its needs. And I think that in 2028, any Democratic candidate who's going to have any hope of getting through the primary process is going to have to be able to pass a certain test. And I wouldn't call it a litmus test. I think it's an authenticity test, which is that the base of the Democratic Party thinks that what just happened in Gaza is wrong. And whether or not October 7th, is the single worst thing that has ever happened in our lifetime, that happens to be true for us, right? I mean, that is our view of October 7th. But for many Democratic voters, and certainly for many young Jewish kids of ours, what happened over the last 2 years is the worst thing that they've witnessed an American ally do to another people. And I think if we don't help Democrats find language that allows them to express empathy on equal measures on both sides. And equal measures is already a difficult phrase because I think Tony Blinken used it a lot, and it may have gotten a little bit delegitimized
Joe Biden
itself.
used it.
It is just going to be an important part of this that has never been seen before. No Democratic platform has ever said anything about the Palestinian people having a right of self-determination and having the right to be free from occupation and to be over this last 57 years. And the United States, from a democratic point of view, has been a facilitator of what Israel has done. And I think that's going to be a real change in 2028. And all of us, are going to have to play a role in helping candidates to find language that allows them not to pick one side over the other, but to make sure that they are being appropriately nuanced and balanced here in their approach to the issue.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add on that, and I so agree with you, Jeremy, and you and I talked about this before, is I do think one thing that has changed is that while voters aren't going to vote on this issue, it's entered the zeitgeist in a way it wasn't before October 7th, before the
Right.
war of the last 2 years. So what you say, if you say one thing on this issue, you're kind of saying, if you just repeat the old AIPAC talking points, you're kind of saying, I am the establishment. I come from Washington. I can be bought by special interests. And if you kind of go all the way off on the left, and you go into the sort of the anti-Zionist spaces, I think to a lot of people, especially in parts of the country that are not New York City, it's going to sound like I am of the far left. I am part of the woke left. I care more about these intra-party fights than I do about making your life better. I don't think either of those approaches is going to work. You're going to need exactly, something you talked about and how you talked about it, Jeremy. And I think part of it is going to be also being able to say Israel is a friend and partner and no blank checks. There are limits. We need to be able to use leverage. All these things we've been talking about are going to be key. Now, let's be clear. I also agree very much. Jeremy, you've talked about everything everywhere all at once. And Dan, you said the same thing. I don't believe in litmus tests, right? If we have somebody who gets through a primary, who aligns with me on a lot of other issues, and they're kind of using the AIPAC talking points and they're a Democrat, I'm going to still vote for them in 2026 because I don't want Mike Johnson or John Thune
to have one more seat.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. And for them to be the majority leader. And there are other things I care more about. And similarly, if we have a group of members, who align themselves with the anti-Zionist left, like a Zoran Mamdani and kind of that position, that's not really like comfortable place for me, but I would also support them in a general election.
Got to build that coalition.
Because we all have to be in this together against a real threat from Donald Trump. So I think what we're talking about is trying to push what I think will be the big fat middle of the Democratic Party and where most Democrats will be. But we're going to have to work with everyone. Is my attitude on this.
So Dan, some final thoughts from you. We're wrapping up towards the top of 1 o'clock in the morning where you are. So we'll let you go soon enough. And why don't you share some final thoughts before we wrap up here?
Okay, thank you. Let me just address one other issue that came up in the previous discussion that you did with Ben and his piece. I think, again, since the proposal that was put out there is, we really need to wash our hands of this relationship. And somehow that's going to create this positive dynamic in the Middle East, the one I'm familiar with. So I just want to say I think the three immediate effects that would come from a real distancing of our relationship. Again, leverage and proper balancing of our relationship is one thing, but the discussion really focused on taking it to a far different level. Three things happen. One is Israel's going to look very vulnerable, right? If the impression and the reality is that the United States is walking away from this relationship, Iran and its allies are going to really accelerate the efforts that are already underway to prepare for another round and maybe a decisive war. And that's really dangerous. That's going to lead to more war, more suffering, and something that we shouldn't take actions that would encourage. Second thing that happens is it undermines what has been for the last 5 to 10 years a bipartisan effort to build integrated coalition of U.S. partners in the region that will do more together, and that the United States can support them, but not always be at the leading edge. When the Arab states who have already normalized their relations with Israel, and the ones who are considering it, a big part of the reason they do that is because of how it helps them get closer to the United States. And if they see the U.S. pulling back from its closest ally, they're going to be much less motivated to do that, and that's going to obviously weaken the process for Saudi normalization. Jeremy, the 23 state solution that J Street talks about, that you talk about, I think would be really, really weakened as a prospect to be achieved if Arab states are saying, okay, this is not really, it doesn't get anything with the United States, because the United States is kind of pulling back from that relationship with Israel. So we're talking about a less stable and more conflict ridden region, and one that frankly doesn't do anything to help Palestinians achieve their rights and aspirations for self-determination in the state of their own, because the incentives are gone. And the last thing that happens is, if Congress is out of the business of providing assistance to Israel, it's going to be business of providing assistance to Jordan and Egypt. Those aid programs are derivative of their peace treaties with Israel. I can't see the one happening without the other. And so Jordan, we always worry about its stability and kind of spillover threats to all of its neighbors, Syria, Iraq, Saudi, West Bank. Egypt's not going to stop arming itself. They'll buy from China and Russia. So we'll be opening the doors for our competitors to really plant their flag in the region. The Gulf states, which probably won't be in a position to buy from the United States in these circumstances, because they'll still be bound by the qualitative military edge limitations. They're going to buy from China and Russia. So the net result is this kind of dramatic decline in U.S. influence in the Middle East. And, I understand people who are looking inward, who say, well, I'm tired of sending those tax dollars overseas, or these aren't good partners anyway. Maybe that looks fine. And it always looks fine early in the isolationism cycle, right? We go through this cycle repeatedly in American history in foreign policy, after in the 1930s and after the Cold War, the sense that we should pull back, we should take care of things at home. And eventually there's a shock, there's a crisis, World War II, 9/11, one that now we can't name, but it'll come, and it'll draw us back in under far worse conditions at a much higher cost. So to me, that's a reason why it's really worth keeping this relationship strong and stable, again, with the limits that it needs to have, and with the leverage to use to make sure outcomes are outcomes we can live with and reflect our values. And I got into this line of work over 30 years ago to try to achieve a two-state solution. I thought it was inevitable. I no longer think that, but it has to still be central to our effort, and it's now endorsed by President Trump. And it might look different, it might take longer, but that still has to be the direction of travel. Palestinians deserve that. Israelis need it. We need it. The region needs it. So, but that is still the right frame. People can dismiss that as somebody else's talking points. That's me talking from my behalf. But I think the risk of deviating away from that frame is, as I described it, to dramatically harm U.S. influence and interests in the Middle East, and I hope we don't go down that route.
Well, I want to say thank you very, very much on behalf of J Street and Word on the Street to Ambassador Dan Shapiro for staying up with us late at night. And I think it's really important for us at J Street, and we hope through this Word on the Street series, to bring a wide variety of viewpoints. And I think that what Ben said last week, what you're saying here, so many of the other voices that we've been having, Elon, I just think it's absolutely critical to have an informed and civil discussion and debate where we agree and where we don't agree. And I think it's really great to hear your points of view, Dan. We've known each other a long time. A lot of respect for you and what you do and what you stand for. And I thank you as a friend for joining us. And Elon, any final word?
Well, actually, the one thing we forgot to tell everybody throughout the entire episode, which is hit the like heart button, retweet, it helps us, gives us, it raises it in the algorithm. So please, if you've stayed on this long, stay on for that last
hit the
piece.
little heart button.
And maybe I'll just close with one actual thing. For me, this is in some ways full circle, because I got my start in foreign policy and Middle East policy really volunteering on the Obama campaign. and I had coffee.
Who was your boss?
Well, I had coffee first with a guy named Ben Rhodes,
Ah.
who I didn't know that well, but we were supposed to connect. And he was like, I just got this job. I was helping manage the Middle East policy group. And now I have to go to Chicago to write speeches for Barack Obama. And so somebody has to take over this and work with Dan Shapiro. And I was like, I'll do that. And so like, I think having both you,
What a
Dan,
small world. I
and
love
Ben
that.
on the last 2 weeks to talk about very different perspectives of this is really like perfect.
That is a great story. That is an absolutely wonderful small world story, and great way to end the conversation. So thank you again to Dan Shapiro. Thanks, Elon. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. And we will see you next week, 4 p.m. Eastern, Word on the Street Live. Thanks, everybody.
Right.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for the opportunity.